Welcome back, audio friends. This is two-channel listening, and I am your host, Jason. While this episode is meant to cover off on the NAD C546BEE, I had a subscriber ask me a question. And that question is, why aren't more reviewers covering off on an important topic of owning physical CDs, media, versus actually just renting media from the monthly subscribers like Spotify? I have to say, the more pen that I put to paper, the more I dove into the ROI myself, this topic looked like it could be something quite controversial, especially as it pertains to the NAD CD player that I have in hand. I think that topic needs some ample exposure all in of itself, not something I'm going to tackle right this second, but I will cover it at some point. So let's get to this NAD. What we have here is the classic line CD player from NAD. The C classic line 546BEE has been in the staples since 2012. Now, fun fact, this particular reviewer, while living in Seattle, went to a brick and mortar and actually purchased the newly revised 545BE back in 2010 at $499. In 2012, the 546 came out, and it has two particular changes, quasi upgrades if you will, that I will discuss in a moment. But it's now $549. Step into 2021 dollars with inflation being very unkind to CD players and many electronics in general, except for probably TVs, flat screen TVs. This player with its internals is now considered the C568BE player. And I can tell you, here's another fact. If you take the spec sheet of the 545 and line it up with the 568 CD players, this $500 CD player versus this $849 CD player today, they are specifically the same. There are very few actual modifications to the unit itself. Some of the op amps, the names have changed, but it still sports the same Wolfson DAC that's doing the 24-bit conversions. And we're going to have to get into that when it comes to the actual, well, how does it sound portion of this review. However, I will say at $549, the build quality is pretty good. On the inside of the player, you have actually a very decent sized toroidal transformer, and it has a very robust power supply. You will find 4 fuses in the circuit board. You have a very nicely laid out PCB, and you're going to see 2 op amps on that PCB board. And as I had mentioned, ever since the 545 revision released in 2009, NAD has been using the Wolfson DAC chip for its 24-bit conversion, regardless if you're using the RCA outs or if you're using the digital outs. Around back, it just doesn't get any simpler when it comes to connecting this 10.8-pound unit. You have two stereo RCA jacks out, providing 2.2 volts to your preamp of choice. You also have 2 digital outs. You can either choose the digital coax or the optical toss link. This unit also carries on with the 12-volt trigger, and for those of you who like to use integrated universal remote systems with programming, it does have an IR sensor for that particular function. Continuing on around front, the simplicity continues. With only 8 physical buttons, including the dial, economy of scale keeps production costs on these units very low, especially when your parts bin at NAD extends 20 years across multiple products. Back to those two key differences from my original 545BE, you're going to have this little selector knob on the upper right hand corner. This knob allows you to push play, it allows you to skip forward or back, and it is your pause function. And another interesting option that I'm surprised to find on a modern 568 is the rather superfluous USB stick port on the front of the case. This is for playing MP3s on a USB stick, which, if you've actually tried it, it is rather cumbersome. It is a slow way to scroll through your favorite songs, and given how many cheap digital DACs are out there today that give you network streaming abilities, this is something that if they wanted to cut 50 bucks out of the cost of this, I would start there. Nevertheless, if you were to find one of these units on the used market, they're getting rather hard to come by. In the last couple of months, I've only seen two of these units, one for $300 and a really nice example with its original remote and box selling for $350 on Hi-Fi Shark. This unit in hand has been on loan to me for the last 2 months from my friend Dave over at Authentic Audio here in Idaho. I definitely would suggest anybody who likes classic products and vintage items, he has some awesome clean examples on his website. Getting into the sound comparisons. Here's where I do my utmost as a reviewer to be as transparent, as open and honest as I possibly can. Those of you who know, I really do appreciate and love my NAD C658 network streamer. I've been using that for many months now, and I found for its price point to be just an exceptional product. It sounds very good, and it has all the functionality that I was looking for in a network player, specifically because it has the awesome Blue OS integration within it. So, in my opinion, the 546BEE is going to sound great and possibly exceed your expectations if you are new to owning CD players and have not owned many CD players before and are moving away from MP3s. 2, if you have very modest, inefficient speakers. Or 3, you paid $300 or less to acquire your NAD 546 or even 568 CD player. Now, whoa, that is some serious if scenarios that sound like very loaded statements. This is true, and here's why. In just this last year, through just the way life works, I have had a number of disc spinners within my graphs being played back in my two listening spaces. My main listening space where I do reviews, and even my bedroom where I do my home theater viewing. I've had the Marantz ND8006. I have the Marantz UD5007 Universal Player. I have the Denon DVD 3930 CI SACD multi-universal player. I had the Denon DCD 12, I had the Denon DCD 1650AR. I've also had and did not review the Yamaha CD2100. And most recently, I've been listening to the Marantz SA11S3 SACD player at $4,000. Borrowed. Starting with my Tekton Uruz ribbon tower speakers, I decided to pair those very efficient speakers with my Red King PSE EL84 tube amplifier that puts out 12 watts in Class A format only. The NAD did a very admirable job at sounding open and honest within the mid-range and the upper treble regions. Playback was always handled at 86 dB or below, mostly between 77 and 83 dB as an average. The first change in the chain would come when I would disconnect the NAD 546 from the stereo coax out, and I switched it to the actual digital coax into my C658. Once I actually used the CD player as more of a transport into the C658, that's when I immediately noticed that there was already a bit of, say, digital hash and grain that was cleaned up from the playback. And another way to say that is when going back to the coax stereo out, I would liken it to listening to those older style Parasound or even Carver amplifiers, and even Sunfire amplifiers for that matter. Most of those big Class A/B stereo amplifiers, they all had a very familiar grain to them during playback. I would actually hear some of that similar digital grain when listening to the NACD player by itself through my Tekton Uruz speakers with the tube amplifier. Another way to say that is, while you feel you're seeing the entire picture outside through the window that you're looking through happens to have just the slightest calcium stains on it, and you're looking through those calcium stains without noticing that there's just a bit of your visibility that is distracted and or distorted. That's how I would characterize this CD player by itself with my very efficient Tekton Uruz loudspeakers. With those same loudspeakers and amplifier, when I put the Denon CD player, noticed that, like anything, the NAD CD player, the NAD 546, it plays to its price point. And no matter what CD player I added to my system, each one would elevate the system pretty much to the amount of money that you would spend. That Denon Universal player was a $1,500 player when it came out. And of course, jumping up to the Marantz SA11S3 at $4,000, while listening to that CD player with the same CDs, it sounded in and of itself as if I had a tube CD player. It was so damn smooth and amazing. It was hard to believe I was playing the same media through that player and through my system. That's the big difference when it comes to price points and the quality playback that you're getting. Now, here's the strange part and why I say if you were to put more inefficient speakers in your system, that would also elevate or in many ways remove some of those grain detractions that I heard with more efficient speakers. When I put my Avalon acoustic speakers in the system and I used my now newly acquired Jeff Rowland amplifier, I no longer heard as much of that grain. It leveled the playing field when connected to the C658 through either the digital coax or with another digital preamp. Now here's where things get, for me, interesting and even a tad controversial. This is where the CDs you have are going to play an important role in how well or how clean your actual CD player sounds. The purpose of using the 4 specific discs was this. I grew up with this. I was listening to Sheryl Crow in high school. And while the All I Want to Do Is Have Fun made major radio play, it was the song We Do What We Can that really spoke to me in high school. And some interesting things I started to notice when using the NAD CD player straight up by itself and then transferring over to listening to that exact same CD burned through my NAS, through my 2 digital preamplifiers slash network players. Playing the Sheryl Crow disc from 1993 through the NAD player, it definitely was tilted more in the upper mid-range and especially in the treble region. Not to say that there was anything harsh about it, but if you were to look at where the balance was on the spectrum of the low end to the high end, the majority of it felt like it was to the upper mid-range playing the songs. And while having my dB meter there handy at all times, I was able to always match the song playback with each player to pretty much within a half a dB, giving the NACD player the extra half a dB just to make sure that any of the other players were not the louder playing unit at that time, so that there would not be any bias of, oh, that one's slightly louder so it must sound better. No, I purposefully allowed the NAD CD player to have the half dB benefit of the doubt. And what was really interesting and the most notable was my Sheryl Crow CD. As soon as I changed from the NACD player over to my digital network playing, that song, I immediately felt it in my pants, I felt it in my chair. There was just more room pressure at the lower ends physically touching me with this particular album, played back only in digital form. But the CD is digital form. So what's happening? Is there something strange with the 2.2 volts that's sending current to the digital analog player itself? Well, that's why I used 2 different network players. And in both cases, both network players gave me deeper, stronger bass with this particular album. Now, when I moved to Layla, Eric Clapton's Unplugged, same thing. I noticed that I was still getting more lower end sound pressure experience with the digital tracks. Now here's the really strange thing. When it comes to Neil Young's Harvest CD, this was the only one that it didn't matter if it was the Tektons, it didn't matter if it was my Avalon Acoustics. This particular track, this particular CD, when played through the NAD or played as a digital file only, I had the least, or I should say this, I could find no recognizable difference. It was nearly impossible for me to pick out any key differences when listening to the NAD CD player with my Avalon Acoustics Jeff Rowland amplifier into the NAD network player or my Eryk S50. If I go back to my SIA, there and again was that bass difference. So of the 4 specific CDs that I picked out, only one of them happened to have 0 difference. Now, while the NAD CD player is not meant to play HD CDs, this is an HD CD. And that was the only key difference with the 4 CDs that I happened to use. Now, did I use several other CDs in the 2 months when using the NAD CD player? Of course. I listened to classical, I listened to all kinds. But when it came to specifically keeping things in line, keeping the decibels in line with the different units, I focused on those 4 discs because it takes quite a bit to listen to these tracks over and over and over, sometimes 4 times per unit, to see if I'm really hearing what I think I am hearing. Interestingly, my body told me more than what my ears were telling me when it comes to the sound pressure in the room and the bass that I was feeling in my chair. Now for the really controversial part. Back to what the review master asked me. How about talking about the physical media, the CDs themselves, and the booklets that you get, and the experience of buying a CD and going through and looking at the album art, looking at the lyrics, and having a physical piece of media that you own, regardless of your CD player. Is it worth it versus renting your media digitally on a monthly basis with a subscription like Tidal or Spotify or Pandora, etc., etc., etc.? Now, this is where it gets interesting for me as a reviewer. While I already have a couple hundred CDs left out of I don't know how many that I've sold over the years myself, and definitely regret selling several of them. Let's say, and I did the research myself, that you can still go to your local rummage sales. You could still go to Craigslist. You will still find boxes of average wear CDs that you can purchase for 50 cents to say $1.50 per unit. Let's say you amass 1,000 CDs. Okay, let's just make it simple and say that's $1,500. Then you find a nice NAD CD player on Hi-Fi Shark for $350. You're now into owning your physical media and being able to play it back for $1,850. How many years of Spotify does that buy you? Obviously, that's rhetorical. Maybe that's not rhetorical, because as Spotify continues to change, as Tidal changes, as Amazon HD comes around and now gives you free access to CD quality music if you're a Prime member, all of a sudden that equation changes a lot. I'm an Amazon Prime member. I use Amazon HD. Therefore, I have a free subscription to digital media after I've spent $5,000 at least amassing the library that I have on my own NAS. The value proposition becomes this. At any given time, if you're a subscriber and you pay for a service, you can obviously quit that service and you give up the convenience of being able to hit random on your phone, dial up whatever your favorites are, or the 100 different playlists that you've built for yourself. You lose that convenience, and there's a lot to be said for that convenience. You wanted to go to the gym, you hit your gym favorites. You're driving on the freeway and you want some Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, you've got your driving experience favorites, and on and on and on it goes. For me, as a reviewer, no, not me as a reviewer. For me as just a consumer who is going to be 43 years old next month, this brings me back to high school. Looking at those pictures, opening up that book, listening to these songs. I remember hearing these songs and touching this disc back then. Sometimes that $1.50 could be worth a lot more with nostalgia than having just the convenience of a subscription. And so, Review Master, in no way, shape, or form can I wholeheartedly address your question of your topic, because for me, and I think for you, it's still worth it to have the physical media in hand, to be able to go to my cabinet. I'm carving out these 48.5 minutes because I just want all my focus to be on this one album that reminds me of the year da 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 da, and really sit in the moment and enjoy that versus having background music with random tracks playing. That, you have to ask yourself, what is that worth to you, the audio enthusiast? I would love your feedbacks in the comment section on what you think about owning the physical media and what it means to you over the years, and how important or precious are some of your favorite discs when you physically pick them up and put them in your player of choice. If you're starting out, if you're new to the audio 2-channel world, if you can find a 546 for $300, I do think you're starting out at a wonderful place to spend many years enjoying music on a very modest budget. That's who I think the NAD C546BEE is meant for. Thank you for your time, and as always, it's my pleasure to do these reviews for you. Next week, and yes, next week, not a skip week, I can't wait to add to what I would consider even part 2 to this review, is my review of the Eryk S50 Pro Plus digital preamp network player. At $220, that little unit is what made me really dig into the ROI on owning physical media and the value proposition of what CD players represent. It is a challenger product and something that is still of a very mixed bag. But that's for next week, and I hope the majority of you tune in for my review on that product. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful December. Stay warm and cozy. Get your hot cocoa.